Not a remake and not a spin-off, we at last have a fresh new Metroid title for the first time since Other M came out in 2010, over 11 years ago. The first one starring Samus Aran anyway, and if you want to talk 2D games, the last one we got was Metroid Fusion all the way back in 2002. Now don't get me wrong, Zero Mission and Samus Returns are both fantastic games that quenched our thirst for a while, and you could argue that you didn't really need to continue the story of Fusion. The X-Parasites are no more and the Metroids are extinct. Where do you go from there? But I think part of why Dread was on so many fans' radars, including myself, was because of the initial teasing since the days of the original DS.
Yoshio Sakamoto, co-creator, director, designer, producer, basically everything involving the Metroid series, pitched a sequel to Metroid Fusion for the Nintendo DS in the mid-2000s. The idea was to expand the concept of the SAX even further, in that there needed to be something more threatening and terrifying chasing after Samus throughout the game, but still feel like a Metroid title and not so much horror-related. Sakamoto tried at least 2 times to get Metroid Dread made, but the DS's capabilities were unfortunately too limited to pull that concept off, which I don't know, given how Metroid Fusion did such a good job with the SAX and how it made you shit in your Varia suit whenever you saw it, and with the DS being more advanced than, well, the Game Boy Advance, I think it could probably be done. There was a playable prototype of Metroid Dread for the DS sent to Nintendo Software Technology and Nintendo of America, not actually called Metroid Dread at that point and apparently rocking the same art style as Fusion. Sakamoto wasn't 100% pleased with how the project was turning out though, again because the limited technology just couldn't handle what he envisioned, so development came to a screeching halt, but the February 2006 issue of Official Nintendo magazine still showed that Metroid Dread was coming out at an unconfirmed date. There's even a log you can scan in Metroid Prime 3 talking about Metroid Project Dread nearing its completion, so something had to have been going on with Metroid Dread, no? However, the director for Prime 3, Mark Bacchini, claimed that it was purely coincidental, to which I say, really? You just so happen to have also called this project Metroid Dread. I somehow find that very hard to believe. By 2010, Sakamoto believed that if they were to return to Metroid Dread, it would all have to be done from scratch, so the fate of the game was pretty dire. In fact, it was essentially cancelled for many years, until Nintendo saw how well Mercury Steam did with Samus Returns for the 3DS in 2017. Much to the surprise of a huge number of fans, including myself, during Nintendo's E3 Direct in June 2021, while they told us that there weren't any further news on Metroid Prime 4's development, we were at least getting another new game for the Switch by Mercury Steam. And there it was, the trailer for the long since deceased Metroid Dread, looking like it was borrowing a lot from Samus Returns, while also introducing these new foes to face called Emmys, more on them later. The sheer amount of hype for this game was unreal. It wasn't a spin-off with cutesy-looking Galactic Federation soldiers. It wasn't a retelling of a game we played nearly 30 years ago. This was something fresh, and not only that, a follow-up to Fusion. What else could possibly happen after wiping out the Metroids and the X-Parasites? I couldn't wait to play it, and I'm also pleased to see that Dread has become the fastest-selling Metroid game to date. 854,000 copies within the first month. Hopefully, this will finally convince Nintendo to give our old bounty hunter more adventures at a more frequent pace, and maybe bring F-Zero back from the dead too? No? Wishful thinking? Alright then. I actually went back to Metroid Fusion after finishing Dread for the first time since I did my video on it 10 years ago, and man, it's still such a good game. One of the best in the series. There were a couple points of progression that I kinda forgot were always pretty cryptic, like placing a bomb in a specific spot or this part in Sector 4 where you're supposed to know to use a morph ball to get through this unforeseen tunnel. Outside of that is some excellent explorative gameplay, albeit more linear than usual Metroid games, along with some very memorable bosses, and of course one of the scariest and most badass villains in Metroid history, the SAX. It's a pity that as of right now, the only other way to play Fusion legitimately apart from buying the original cartridge is with the Wii U port, unless you were part of that 3DS Ambassador program by purchasing a 3DS prior to August 2011, where Fusion was one of the free games you could download, and for some reason can't play it now. I very much want to remake my old Metroid videos someday because, well, they're not very good, being some of the first reviews I've ever done and having no idea what to do with my channel. These and the Tomb Raider videos I did many years ago are some of the ones I dread looking back at the most. Haha, you see what I did there? I'll give them the proper trash or treasure treatment in due time, perhaps even go back to the Prime series and Other M afterwards, since I think those could do with some improving too. Moving all of that aside, and I know this is still a new game right now, but if you've watched my channel throughout the past 10 plus years, you should be aware by now that I spoil stuff. But as usual, I'll provide a timecode here to skip the plot summary and my thoughts on certain moments. There will be minor spoilers afterwards, like showing some of the bosses, but you should be fine for the most part. After very, very briefly explaining what happened during the events of Metroid Fusion that now just makes me want to see an HDI's version of the GBA classic, the Galactic Federation record video evidence of the X-Parasites possibly surviving on the planet ZDR. The X-Parasites being these colorful, gooey blobs that infect and mimic whatever they touch, killing the original afterwards, making them one of the biggest threats Samus had to face in Fusion. But because of the Metroid DNA she got injected with in that game, and the Metroids being predators to X-Parasites, she can absorb them without a scratch on her. It was also how the SAX came to be by replicating a fully powered up Samus, upgrades and everything. The Federation reacted to this by dispatching 7 robots to take a look into the matter but quickly lost contact with them. These robots are known as Extraplanetary Multiform Mobile Identifiers, or EMMIs for short, who were kind of like NASA's rovers that get sent to Mars for gathering information such as Curiosity and the now lost Opportunity. EMMIs are also things that shows like Glee didn't deserve to be nominated for. Out of desperation anyway, the Federation sent the video to Samus asking for her help once again, almost as if they're her only clients for bounty hunting. At this rate, Samus just needs to go to another part of the galaxy far away from the Federation so they stop bugging her. She agrees to assist regardless to make sure the X-Parasites are dealt with once and for all, and joining her is the computerized Adam Malkovich returning from Metroid Fusion, thankfully keeping his mouth shut about restricting her power-ups. Adam doesn't really have much purpose in being here though, he's usually just pointing out stuff you're already aware of or sometimes the painfully obvious. And similar to Fusion, having to stop and chat to him kinda slows the pacing down, not as annoyingly as Fusion granted, but Adam can be pretty useless at times. There could just be one moment where your adrenaline's pumping and you want to run, blast, and jump your way through ZDR, only to get stopped by Adam because he has to tell you for the 5th time to use the Phantom Cloak to your advantage. Yeah, no shit, of course I'm gonna want to use it against the killer robots after me. Whoops, getting ahead of myself there. When Samus lands her ship in ZDR, which I did think was cool to see the same one from Fusion again, deep underground she encounters a beefy and aggressive Chozo warrior who proves to be too much for Samus, almost killing her in their bout, but simply leaves her unconscious for a little while, removing most of her upgrades in the process. Being the 5th 2D game in the timeline, Samus is probably thinking to herself, for Christ's sake, I really need to update my VPN so that this doesn't keep happening. Adam proceeds to tell Samus to return to her ship. Yeah, again, thanks Commander. I figured I'd stay here for a bit longer and let the monsters eat me. But while beginning her way back to the surface, she runs into one of the EMMIs who've been reprogrammed to kill her on sight. By defeating what I swear is an underling of Mother Brain, Samus gets access to the Omega Blaster that can only be used once to destroy an EMMI before it suddenly deactivates. You go through this same process a few more times until around halfway through the game where Samus gets saved from another EMMI by a surviving Chozo named Quiet Robe as he deactivates the rest of them. You can actually see Quiet Robe in some of the Chozo memories unlocked in Samus Returns, though the name Quiet Robe's a little silly to me honestly. He explains in a hefty information dump anyway, that long ago there lived 2 Chozo tribes, the deadly warriors known as the Makin, and the peaceful scientists called the Toha. Wait, wasn't that a race in Bionicle? The Makin and the Toha once joined forces to entrap the Metroids in their home planet SR388, with the Toha wanting to completely eradicate SR388, which Samus herself managed to do by the end of Metroid Fusion. Meanwhile, the Makin wanted to use the Metroids as weapons to help them take over the galaxy, much like the space pirates, all under the leadership of the evil Ravenbeak, the same Chozo that we met at the start of the game, and that name is even sillier to me than Quiet Robes. I can just imagine somebody at Mercury Steam coming up with this on their lunch break.
Quick, we need a name for our villain in 30 seconds. Name a type of bird. Okay, how about a raven? Good. And, what do ravens have? Beaks. Perfect, we'll call him Ravenbeak. You sure about that? That name doesn't seem all that threatening. Look, the fans have waited almost 2 decades for a new 2D Metroid. They'll take anything at this point.
Not pleased with their disagreements, Ravenbeak put an end to the Toha tribe but spared Quiet Robe so that the Metroids could be controlled with his Toha DNA. However, before that plan could take effect, one of the Makin soldiers got infected with the X-Parasite as they made their way back to ZDR, causing a pandemic to occur, and with the Metroids now extinct, there's no possible way to rid of all the parasites, unless Samus frequently went around the world and absorbed them all. Ravenbeak thought to counter this by having the EMMIs extract the Metroid DNA within Samus so that the Metroids could finally be reborn, luring her into ZDR to begin with. Samus tells Quiet Robe that she'll put a stop to Ravenbeak and restore the planet to normal. Oh yeah, Samus actually speaks again in this game. Only the once, and it's in the Chozo's language. But thank Jesus it isn't another REM situation again. This is how you do it. Just have Samus speak when it's necessary and stick to her battle-hardened character. Unfortunately, after Quiet Robe opens a barrier for further progression, he gets killed off by one of Ravenbeak's Robo-Chozos. Okay. And after exploring the newer areas, she finds the dreaded X-Parasites, accidentally releasing them to the rest of ZDR, one of them even reanimating Quiet Robe so that the Emmys can function again. Samus clears all but one despite that and completely massacres the last Emmy by sapping away its energy with her hand that's been enveloped by the Metroid DNA, slowly corrupting her body. With the Emmys gone, all that's left is to take care of Ravenbeak inside his Sky Fortress, who's actually been posing as Adam this whole time, or just this very moment, I'm not actually sure, honestly. Adam never calls Samus Lady again after the game's opening, so I guess that was meant to be a hint, but I'm not sure. It turns out there was a reason he spared Samus's life, as Ravenbeak wanted her to fully awaken her abilities as a Metroid-human hybrid. Not only that, but Ravenbeak also donated some of his DNA into Samus whilst the Chozo were taking care of her as a little girl, making Ravenbeak believe that Samus is technically his daughter. He then tries to order Samus into giving in and switching sides, but she doesn't like the cut of his jib and proceeds to shoot the crap out of him in one of the hardest yet fulfilling final bosses the Metroid series has ever gotten, in my opinion. I even had to trek my way back through previous areas to collect every expansion I now had access to with my fully powered suit. After many failed attempts, I defeat Ravenbeak, but he manages to get a chokehold on Samus and yet again changes his plans to now clone Samus multiple times to create the most powerful Metroid army the galaxy has ever seen. However, just before Samus blacks out, she finds herself in a fit of rage, fully awakening to her powers as a Metroid, as she practices her best anime shout and sucks the life away from Ravenbeak while also causing the fortress to crumble. Donning some brand new armor that, I'm sorry, I think looks friggin' ridiculous. I understand that it's meant to resemble more to an actual Metroid, but were there not any other pleasing colors than this puke green? And were the spikes essential? She looks like one of those evil nasty bikers you see in cheesy 80s sci-fi movies. Anyway, Ravenbeak miraculously survives from all that chaos, but does get infected by an X-Parasite that turns him into a new form, which sadly you only get a scripted fight with as Samus uses her souped-up Hyper Beam from Super Metroid to blast him to smithereens, along with the X-Parasites that infected Ravenbeak in the first place. In true Metroid fashion, ZDR begins to self-destruct with Samus making it back to her ship, but the real Adam warns her that her Metroid powers would only drain the energy from it. Then we see that the Quiet Robe X has snuck himself on board, but instead of attacking the bounty hunter, it allows itself to be absorbed by Samus so that the Metroid powers within her are more stabilized, as if it was mimicking the same gentle soul that the original Quiet Robe had. Though wait, why did he reactivate the Emmys then? Oh well, with Samus now able to fly the ship again, they get out of ZDR just as it bursts into a fiery explosion. Unfortunately, unlike the older 2D games and even the Prime series, the traditional multiple endings you would unlock depending on how fast you finish the game and how many item expansions you collected, have instead been replaced by artwork that's based on all of Samus's previous adventures. These do look fantastic, don't get me wrong, but I miss being able to see more of Samus out of her power suit within a quick enough time. I do really like this one though, with Samus in front of all the foes she's encountered in her career, and Adam simply looking away from it all like, seen it. The Zero Suit edition is just as sweet, but again, I would have liked to have seen some artwork dedicated to only her as one of the rewards. At the very least, by gathering all of the items, just like in Samus Returns, you can check out these Chozo memories, showing the lives of Quiet Robe and Ravenbeak before X-Parasites entered the scene. And damn, the Chozos are ripped! Who would have guessed? And wait, should I be wondering what's underneath those loincloths? How much of them are bird and how much of them are human?
I should really stop before I give Tumblr any ideas.
Pretty standard Metroid story overall, I would say, but that's okay. I'm not expecting RPG levels of storytelling when it comes to this series anyway. Each game usually sprinkles little bits of lore to gradually flesh out the overarching narrative, and that's what Dread does too. I really feel sorry for anybody that hasn't played Metroid Fusion at all within the past 19 years, because outside of the opening description, Dread's not very friendly about keeping you up to speed with what's happened so far. However, I greatly appreciate how cinematic Dread is compared to the other games, thanks to the boost in technology since the Wii and 3DS days. The cutscenes aren't all that abundant, but they're some of the most well-made in the series with full-on voice acting again too, even if half of it is in Chozo. I'm sure this probably raises concerns after how they handled voice acting in other REM, but rest assured that Metroid Dread is nowhere near as chatty, and Samus doesn't frequently talk about babies, motherhood, or her douche of a commander. She's back to her badass old self, taking no shit from anyone or anything. I do wonder where exactly they're gonna go from here story-wise given how the ending plays out, but I'm sure they can think of something. Metroid Fusion in itself wrapped things up in a nice little bow, and like I said earlier, you probably didn't need to continue the story from there onwards. But if they had to do it, then Dread does a decent job at tying some loose ends, while not making it feel like this is the very end of Samus's bounty hunting career. And how does her newest journey to another planet that's inevitably going to meet its untimely demise play? Yeah, it's pretty good, I guess. I'm joking, of course, it's outstanding. We're back to a fully non-linear style of progression similar to Super Metroid. No cramped environments, no security locks halting your path twice. It is up to you to figure out where you need to go next with no objective markers or anything to help you. Just your eyes to see which area hasn't been explored yet. Although you can put markers on the map again like in Samus Returns in case you do lose your way. I will say that the design of the map itself can be somewhat confusing at first, because there are so many different icons for different doors and item expansions that for some reason don't disappear even after collecting them, just faded a little bit. Then there's the various colors for certain types of rooms like save points, elevators, and ones with extreme temperatures, on top of the several ME zones spread across the planet, which I'll talk about in a moment. Not to mention some rooms might have specific ways of navigating, like the morph ball that you don't get until surprisingly a lot later in the game than usual, giving me much more appreciation for it than I previously had. I will never take the morph ball for granted again after this game. The map as a whole can be visual overload at points, sort of making it difficult to pinpoint exactly where you need to go next. It's part of the reason I got severely lost a few times in Metroid Dread, and I'll admit it does kinda suck when you're trying to get from one side of the planet to another, but sometimes a supposed shortcut might be blocked, so you have to find another way around. Even worse is when there's an item expansion that's just beyond your reach, like a missile tank hiding in a crawling space, and Samus can't grab it because she doesn't have the morph ball. Look, I know you're carrying 30 tons of armor on you, girl, but you seriously can't just scoot your way through and get it? Also rather bothersome is how most of the missile tanks only put an extra 2 missiles to your overall counter, giving Mercury Steam the opportunity to just place a bunch of missile expansions that you can't get yet until you're more powered up. I know Metroid's shtick is that you have to come back to become more armed and dangerous, but the amount of teasing Dread does sorta gets on my nerves at times. I like that the maps tell you where some of the expansions are in the general vicinity this time, but finally locating it and realizing you can't actually grab it is kinda anticlimactic. Still, I'd rather have exploration done like this than be trapped in hallways for 10 hours. I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep bringing up Other M, but it's just so nice to be able to play a new Metroid game that goes back to what made the series so good in the first place. Taking it easy your first time through to make sure you know what you're doing, and then trying to see how fast you can beat it on multiple playthroughs. Load times are pretty long though when traveling from one major section of ZDR to another, taking maybe 30 to 40 seconds, but for the most part, getting from place to place is a non-issue. Samus herself controls like a dream compared to Samus Returns. For starters, she can once again aim in 360 degrees by holding down the L button, but she's also now able to do that while on the move. I still end up just standing in place and shooting that way because I find it easier to aim as a whole and can get out of that stance easily, but it's nice to have more options. I'm more glad that the returning counters can be performed when moving. It completely removes the stop-and-go gameplay that we got in the 3DS entry, making for a much faster pace. Samus additionally has a new slide maneuver that you can simply do by tapping ZL while running, and it's great. You can slip your way through any small tunnels on the floor until you get the morph ball, and a few enemies and bosses can be taken advantage of by sliding under them just as they're about to attack, which is so very satisfying to do and then pumping them full of missiles afterwards. I enjoyed having this slide a lot, and I hope it comes back in future games, at least the 2D ones, or should I say 2.5D. I'm also very happy to say that wall jumping is more utilized than last time, thanks to Dread's more open spaces, as opposed to Samus Return's somewhat claustrophobic level design. It still doesn't work the same way as Super Metroid or Zero Mission, but I found myself using it a lot more often than I did before. Hell, I even managed to get this missile expansion right here earlier than intended thanks to the wall jump. It was an exhilarating feeling to be able to do that again since Super. I do really miss the jingle though. Whenever you pick up an expansion, you instead get this soulless sound effect. At least Samus Returns used the one from the Prime series. Couldn't they just do it again here? It's gotta be better than nothing. Ah well, nitpicky Metroid fanboy stuff, and with controls this good, you'll have a better time exploring and shooting as opposed to collecting items. The only small issue I have with the controls is when things get a teeny bit cumbersome with power-ups like the grapple beam, because if you want to be precise, you need to hold down the L button to aim in 360 degrees, ZR to enable the grapple beam in the first place, and then Y to fire. Now I don't mind this so much when it comes to shooting missiles since I can focus more on where I'm firing at a standstill, but swinging between grapple points has never been Metroid's strong suit, and this game is sadly no exception. Similarly, the speed booster makes a comeback and it's awesome to see again, with the Shine Spark being just as cool to use as it always is, but activating the Shine Spark in midair is a little finicky in this game for me personally. Granted, I've never been too good at doing it in the older titles, but I think I had the most trouble in this one, and my best method ended up being to turn into a ball form, immediately come out, and then press the jump button to perform the Shine Spark. If you want every item expansion in the game, you're unfortunately gonna have to get used to this, because some of them require pulling off extra fancy speed boosting tricks to reach them. This one right here took me almost 15 minutes to get with how strict the time limit was for storing Shine Spark energy and how much was in the way. Pretty much every power-up from previous games are all here, including the diffusion beam from Metroid Other M, which I honestly was not expecting to return, though sadly it's not as useful as it was in that game. Enemies rarely group up together and the diffusion beam doesn't spread that far anyway, so I only used it for specific breakable walls that needed it. For new power-ups, there's actually quite a few, some of which being helpful and others not so much. The spider magnet's one of the earliest ones you get, which allows Samus to climb these blue walls like an ectoplasmic Spider-Man. It's a pretty cool one, if not a little situational, but it gets more use when hiding against the Emmys. At some point you'll also get the spin boost that acts as a double jump, which ends up being almost pointless to have aside from a couple of instances, because it's not too long before you acquire the space jump to make it obsolete. Cross bombs are eventually obtained too, leaving a vertical and horizontal trail of morph ball bombs to cross any tunnels with pit blocks. And that's all they're really needed for aside from enemies lurking in said tunnels. Not a bad upgrade, but nothing too special. The new storm missiles are a bit better though. Much like Seeker missiles from the Prime games, it's necessary to destroying a multitude of blocks at the same time and targeting more missiles onto enemies. Only it's a lot easier to pull off this time, and there's an onslaught of missiles that are fired instead of basing it on how many targets there are. I highly recommend that you abuse storm missiles for later bosses to take them down faster and save you stress. Aeon abilities are back from Samus Returns as well, only they're a lot more limited now, in that there's just the Pulse Radar making a reappearance, once again highlighting any breakable surfaces to find hidden goodies or paths of progression. It drains the yellow bar below your health too, just like in Samus Returns, but in Dread it quickly regenerates as opposed to needing to find recharge stations or grab yellow orbs that drop from enemies. The only other two power-ups that use Aeon are the new Flash Shift and the Phantom Cloak. The Flash Shift is simply a dash Samus can do up to 3 times by pressing the A button before the Aeon has to quickly fill itself up again, and you can also do this in mid-air. It's a lot like the dash in Doom Eternal if you need a comparison. I only really use this for fast-paced boss fights, but better to have and not need than to need and not have, you know? The Phantom Cloak is probably the weakest of the power-ups. Its only major purpose is to pass by certain doors and make yourself invisible to enemies, but Samus can only walk slowly, can't jump very high, and if you try shooting a door or something, that depletes almost all of your Aeon, which then starts draining your health to compensate for it. It's as situational as it gets for me, and a lot of the time I'm just running through the Emmy zones, making sure the Emmys don't get too close to me. Yeah, let's talk about them now. The Emmys may be in secluded areas, but they are every bit as dangerous as we're led to believe. If they touch you, you'll only have 2 chances to counter them in an extremely strict time window before they instantly kill you, and you're booted right back to the start of the Emmy zone. The Emmys may also have limited Metal Gear cone vision, but their hearing sensors are second to none. Unless you're practically far away, even if they're in another room, there's a high chance the Emmys will hear your footsteps and go to investigate. The Phantom Cloak and Spider Magnet can help mitigate the issue, but only for so long. And personally, when I did get caught, it was more annoying than scary compared to the SAX in Fusion. I think the reason your heart pounds at the mere sight of the SAX is because we know exactly how powerful Samus is by the end of a Metroid game. So to have that completely backfire on us as if we're now one of those weak-ass enemies we frequently kill is horrifying. Those loud, echoey footsteps from the SAX with that eerie background music would additionally let you know that it's hot on your tail, and if you do anything to stand out, it will hunt you down. Dread tries to do something similar with the Emmys, but it isn't difficult to simply use the Phantom Cloak to drive it away, and their method of attack doesn't look especially painful. I'm sure it pinches a fair bit, but not enough to kill her. And even if they are just extracting Metroid DNA from Samus, they still can't leave their zone, so what's stopping Samus from just continuing on and grabbing the Omega Blasters to blow them to Kingdom Come, apart from necessary power-ups? It is gratifying when you finally get to kill the Emmys after spending so long avoiding them, but the Emmy zones altogether kinda slow the game down to a crawl until you leave, and that's a really big shame. Doubly so for the upgraded Emmys later on. The purple one that's supposed to represent the wave beam was probably my least favorite since it can see past walls, and that got frustrating trying to hide from it. I like the Emmy's design though, and I even got the amiibo for it alongside Samus's new one. Do I have to rip it open? I can't afford getting another set just to display them. I always hate doing this. Scanning the Emmy amiibo gives you a Missile Plus tank that adds 10 more missiles to your maximum capacity instead of 2, while the Samus amiibo gives you a free energy tank, which does sorta bug me that this gets locked away. It's not just because it's a needless paywall to begin with, although that doesn't help, but when playing the game without the amiibo, collecting all the energy tanks still leaves one empty space to tease your OCD. They knew you had to buy it to fill up that hole, the goddamn jerks. The Emmy zones may be some of the least interesting portions of the game, but there's plenty to look forward to, especially the numerous boss fights, which are all very cool in their own way, with maybe a few exceptions, but they have their bits of fun too. It was incredible to see Kraid again after such a long hiatus since Zero Mission, and man does he hurt! The Experiment number Z57 boss fight was one of my personal favorites. Some trial and error was involved, but it was way more energized and satisfying to me than the Diggernaut in Samus Returns. Didn't really care for the reoccurring fights against the Chozo warriors though, robots or otherwise. They were decent fights, but the amount of recycling and minor tweaks for each one gets needlessly repetitive. Metroid Dread can be pretty challenging at times too, even more so than Samus Returns. No attack is unavoidable, huh? Yeah, you may as well be telling us, get good, scrub. This is probably more of a game that caters towards old school fans and any newcomers that might enjoy something to test their skills, which might be a bit risky for a franchise that's had a very long recess, but the difficulty never bothered me personally, even with the balls to the walls hard final boss.
I understand though that I'm looking at Metroid Dread from the perspective of a longtime fan, so there's probably going to be a hint of bias somewhere, but you know what? I really don't care because I had way too much fun with this game.
This is seriously one of the best Metroid games I've played in what's felt like forever. Some problems do exist, make no mistake, but they hardly bring the game down in any way. And I urge you to please take a look at Metroid Dread to give it the support it needs so that Nintendo can finally start making more games in the series. It's graphically one of the Switch's best so far, running at a full 60 frames per second and rarely ever dipping. The music, I'll admit, isn't quite the best Metroid OST, outside of old familiar tunes, but maybe I need to spend more time with it before I fully appreciate it. As of right now, the atmospheric pieces are all fine, but something more catchy would be better appreciated, in my opinion anyway. Aside from that, Dread is an excellent game to speedrun as well, in true Metroid fashion. Hell, I've already finished this game like 4 times, twice on normal mode and twice on hard mode just to unlock all of the endings. I had to get them all, damn it, but I was never bored at any point, and there are very few games that make me want to replay them as quickly as I did with Metroid Dread.
It is nearly Christmas time, so by all means get Metroid Dread for your loved ones, along with an OLED Switch if you don't own a Switch already, and take a gander at our faithful bounty hunter's newest journey. Hope to see Prime 4 very soon. Before anyone asks, I swear I will talk about Metroid Prime Federation for someday. There have just been a lot of other games I wanted to do first, including this year's Yakuza video, since, like I said, it is almost Christmas time. It'll be on Kiwami 2, a remake of the second game. This review's gonna have to wait until after Christmas most likely though. I unfortunately caught a nasty cough while making this video, so progress got delayed. Until then, thank you everyone for watching, stay safe, stay healthy, have yourself a Merry Christmas, Hanukkah, or whatever else you celebrate, and take care of yourselves. But I think what a lot of people... I forgot where I was going with this. Was because of the initial teasing since the original DS... Since the original days of the Wii... Damn it. Since the days... No! Damn it! Oh, this is frustrating. Teasing since the days of the original DS. Whoa, finally, got one. Talk about Metroid Prime for...